Boy, it really is so good to see everybody. It's just awesome. So I was telling a few folks this morning, I was afraid to death I'm going to forget my sermon because it feels like I'm preaching for the first time ever. It's just been such a long time. And I've been preaching to that camera, which actually is facing that way. So, Vicki, do you mind just rotating it just a little bit, kind of point it this way just a little bit? So,
see if I can
if
see
it'll
it.
turn. There you go. It's a little closer. All right. I did go ahead and record it yesterday just in case this doesn't work, and so we can still get it up on the internet. So you want to see my face, huh? Yeah. Unfortunately, this is just what we're going to have to do for a little while. So, but hey, it's great that we have this space and we can do this, right? So now if we could just get the sun to work with us just a little bit more. So. All right, so I'm going to start a new sermon series today. We're going to talk about the enemies of gratitude. And today we're going to talk about nostalgia. And nostalgia is not necessarily a bad thing, but it can be. So we're going to kind of talk about both sides of that. So our text, though, is from Exodus. We're going to look at Exodus chapter 17, verses 1 through 7. From the wilderness of Sin, the whole congregation of the Israelites journeyed by stages, as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. The people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" The people thirsted there for water, and the people complained against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt, to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried out to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." The Lord said to Moses, "Go ahead of the people, and take some of the elders of Israel with you. Take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will be standing there in front of you at the rock of Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it, so that the people may drink." Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. He called the place Misa and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Now, when we read this passage, and when we look at all the other passages where the Israelites have just consistently not gotten it, it's easy for us to kind of condemn them, isn't it? Easy for us to kind of judge them. But folks, thirst is real. How long can you go without water? 3-4 days, right? So it's not like they had steak and they were whining because they wanted cake. This was something they really, really needed. And they hadn't spent a lot of time walking with the Lord. But Moses is frustrated with them because Moses has already gotten it. He's gotten that their problem is trust. They're not trusting the Lord. They're asking the wrong question. See, they're so busy focusing on what they don't have, they haven't looked at all the things God has done for them. Let's just kind of make a list here. So they're in slavery in Egypt. They're very unhappy, and they want out. So they ask God to rescue them. So God sends Moses to rescue them. So Moses comes, and the first thing we see is these 10 plagues, and God protects the Israelites from these 10 plagues as he begins to decimate what was the most powerful country in the world at that time. Just one plague after another. Finally, to the point where Pharaoh says, "Okay, you guys can go. Get. We'd just love for you guys to leave. And take your God with you. I mean, this just isn't working for us." And so they leave, but then Pharaoh changes his mind, right? And sends an army after them. And so this army starts to chase them down, and they start running, and what do? They run into a sea. And they realize that they're going to die. But what does God do? Part it for them. Boy, wouldn't you just give anything to see God work like that? You know? I mean, wouldn't that be so cool? So God parts the sea, they walk through it, and then they see the army destroyed behind them. And now that they're on the other side, they now start getting hungry. And so they complain about being hungry. And God sends manna 6 days a week. Supposedly it tasted like honey. Can you imagine that? 6 days a week, and of course on the 6th day he provides enough that they can have enough for the 7th day. And then when they get tired of manna and they complain that they want meat, he sends quail. So God has just provided and provided and provided. And they finally get to some water that's bitter. They can't drink it. I imagine it was probably salty or just bad. And they complain about that, and God tells Moses to throw a stick in it. And it's sweet and drinkable. So do you really think God took them all this way and did all this stuff and he's just going to let them die of thirst? He's not. But the problem is, what are they thinking about? They're thinking about what they don't have instead of thinking about all the things that God has done. See, the problem is that sometimes when we think about what we don't have and we don't learn a lesson from our past, we forget and we don't trust. And if they had learned from the past and thought about that instead of just whining about what they didn't have, they would have said, oh, God didn't bring us out here to die. And I just want to point out, by the way, that Rephidim is a very, if they know for sure where it is, it's a very dry place. Farmington looks very green, comparatively. I mean, it's just sand and rock. And so they just couldn't imagine how God could provide in a situation like that. And so instead of using the past to teach them to trust God, they began to whine to want to go back to Egypt. Really? You want to go back to Egypt? Where you were slaves? Where you were whining to leave? Where you couldn't decide from day to day what you wanted to do? A fever wouldn't get you out of work. And you couldn't pick your career path. Where the Pharaoh had decided to use killing children as population control. I can't believe that sounded good. But it's the nostalgia turned in on itself. Not used as a lesson, but instead used with rose-colored glasses on that have blocked the real truth. So, nostalgia itself really isn't bad, is it? I mean, all of us appreciate sitting down with family and going through a scrapbook or an album. I mean, just this last Christmas when we were with my dad, it was really neat to sit down and hear some of his stories that he'd never told us before. I had no idea he'd been to Japan twice. He wanted to go to Korea. He had joined the army so he could go to Korea, and they stationed him in Japan. So he deployed. He signed up again and took a second tour so he could go to Korea, and they sent him back to Japan. He did finally get to go to Korea, but then we found out they had groomed him to do counterintelligence. I had no idea. How awesome it was, though. I mean, that's a wonderful thing to sit down and look and listen to the stories of our families and our friends and think on it. But where nostalgia goes wrong is when we begin to focus instead on the lessons learned and appreciate it, and instead we focus on what we don't have. You know, when I sit and look and say, I don't have this and I don't have that, I forget what God can do and what God has done. And that's sadly what the Israelites had done. They were asking the wrong question. They were asking the question, God, why aren't you providing this? Instead of looking back at their past and saying, oh, you know what I've learned from my past? God has always come through. He's always rescued us. So when we look backwards, it's okay to learn a lesson from it, but it's not okay to take looking backwards. Oops, sorry, lost my page. I don't even know why I'm trying because I can't read it. I tried writing it bigger, but it's just not big enough. All right, so when you focus on what you don't have, then you lose that trust in God, and then what do? You try to go back and relive the past, don't you? Can you? It's physically impossible to relive the past. You absolutely can't do it. Past sometimes, too, isn't as grand as we remember it. But you just can't relive the past. And probably every one of us has been in a situation where someone tried to make the present look like the past. And did you get anything done? No. Have you ever been in one of those committees or one of those groups where there's somebody, no matter what you say, they say, we've never done it that way. No, we did that once, you can't do it. And you can't get any forward progress. And instead of being able to do, you can't relive the past, of course, because it's gone. So you can't even live in the future. You can't live in the present or the future because somebody's trying to control and recreate the past. So I want to talk about 3 areas today where nostalgia can go wrong. Like I said, it can be a good thing. But 3 areas where it can go wrong. And I want to talk big first. The big C church, and then we're going to talk about New Covenant, and then we're going to talk about our personal lives. So the big C church. Church has had some glory days. It really has. The Methodist Church, by the way, in the 1800s, early 1900s, grew phenomenally. The Methodist Church preachers were used to riding circuits. And so what they would do is they'd literally get on horseback, and they would ride from small town to small town to small town. And so like once a month, they would visit a small town and hold a little service. And they were the first of the preachers, by the way, to move west. That's why you see so many Methodist churches so far west, is because they were just used to riding horses. That's okay, we'll go west. It's all right. If you ever go through Kansas, you'll come to these little bitty towns that can barely support Dairy Queen, and they'll have a huge, giant Methodist church. You grew up there, didn't you? And the reason is, though, is because this westward expansion, these pastors are willing to come out there and start a church. And all the surrounding communities would come into that church, and eventually they'd build a great big building. That was some glory days for the Methodist Church. But that doesn't mean it was perfect. Ask some of those churches trying to support those big buildings now what it's like. How hard that is. Then the church had another glory day in the 1950s. Everybody came back from war. They'd seen horrors unimaginable. And they got back into church. And they drove all the kids to church. So everybody went to church in the 1950s. And so we saw this other giant resurgence in the church. Everybody going to church. But guys, there was problems in the churches in the 1950s. I couldn't have been your pastor in 1950. And ask an African American if they'd want to go back to 1950. Not that they're not struggling now, but they certainly wouldn't want to go back to 1950. So some of our glory days aren't all perfect. 1980s was another one. I was one of those 80s kids when every church was building a gym and had kids programs. They were taking kids on bus trips. I mean, there were some awesome things. It was really cool, though, that kids could do something in a church environment and not be out on the street, right? But did we really disciple those kids? How many of them are still in church? How many of them are leaders in our church? So every age has its good points and its bad points. And we should learn from those good things and the bad things, but let's not go back and try to recreate those things. Because that's not going to happen. We're not going to be able to recreate it. And God may be doing something new with the church, and we want to get on board with that and go wherever God wants to go. God didn't have just a little bit of good heydays for the church that he handed out in the 1800s and 1950s and the 1980s, and he's all out. He's got more. If we're willing to learn and trust and move into the present and go into the future, I guarantee you God's arm's not too short to do something more with the church. It just may not look like it did in the past. So that brings us to New Covenant. I have no idea what post-COVID is going to look like. But it's going to be different. And we may miss some things. We may have some people that never come back. some programs that we just can't recreate or redo, some things. Who knows? We may even move the piano. We're going to rearrange your seats. We were wondering if everybody would be able to figure out where to sit. So it may not be the same. And we will miss some things. And it's okay to talk about them and enjoy them. But some of it we may not need to repeat. We may not want to grab back to. For example, we've moved into the digital age finally. This church didn't have much of a website, and we certainly weren't recording our sermons and getting them online. Just last month, we had over 21 hours of people watching just off one of our platforms, and we have 3 platforms. I didn't look at the statistic on the other 2, but that means 68 people tuned in and watched the entire service. I mean, we're reaching people that probably couldn't come to church or that don't want to come to church. Shut-ins that we've kind of left out. So COVID has pushed us into a new era here at New Covenant. And I think we ought to just be excited and learn from our past and grab hold of some of the new and just move forward with it. See what God wants to do with us. And then let's go to the personal level. Let's talk about the personal level. Nostalgia, where it can go wrong. Every one of us at some point in our walk, especially when we first start out, we can struggle with trusting God. And that's normal. As a matter of fact, you'll notice in this passage, God doesn't get on to the Israelites. Moses is a little upset, but God doesn't get on to him. He just simply tells Moses to go to the rock, tap the rock, and let the water flow. Because he knows that these people haven't finished growing yet. They haven't come into that point where they trust him yet, despite parting of water, which, I feel like would be enough, But they haven't gotten to that point. So God has all this mercy for them, and he just simply says, give them water. But there does come a point in our walk where we have enough history, we've seen God provide manna when we've needed it, and ways out of situations like opening seas when we need it, that we should be trusting. And the Israelites, of course, we know, won't get it, will they? They're going to spend 40 years not getting it, to the point where God says, okay, you've seen enough. You should trust me now. I'm sorry, you're not going to the promised land. I'm going to let your kids go, but you guys are not going to go. And so for every one of us, there becomes a point in our life, too, where God says, you know what, Tinker, it's time that you trust me. So quit asking the wrong question. Quit looking at your life and saying, God, why haven't you given me this? Why aren't you doing this for me? If I'd look at my past and all the times that God has answered and provided, I would know that that's the wrong question. The question should be, God, I know you're going to get me through, and I'm curious to see how you do it. Because God can come up with so many ways of rescuing us that we just can't imagine. But when we try to imagine the solution, when we look at dry sand and rocks and think there's no way God can provide water, then we begin to lose trust. And the problem when we ask the question, God, why aren't you doing this stuff for me? We end up getting angry, don't we? We get angry and we get resentful. And you know what one of the biggest barriers between us and God can be? Is resentment. When we have resentment in our heart, we're really putting a barrier between us and God. We're really shutting the door on God and saying, you know what, if you don't do things my way, God, I'm just not going to listen. So I pray this week that we will all be open to whatever God has for our future as the Big C Church, as New Covenant, and in our personal lives. God is always willing and able to provide and open up pathways for all of us. Amen. Well, there, I remembered most of it.
We'll watch it on YouTube and see it.
There you go.